Welcome to Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast from behind my counter between customers. Join me while I sit behind my retail counter and just have a conversation with you, or with myself. While I look out the window, observe what I see, things that are happening in the store today, throughout the week, and just fun little stories that I have from my time as a business owner. This is something that you find interesting, then keep listening, and I appreciate you. Hey everyone, welcome back to episode, I don't remember what number is it, 6? I think it's 6. Whatever it is, welcome back. And today's episode is something that I've been really interested in. And if you've been on, especially TikTok, which I am on TikTok, and I do like it for some things. I like making fun videos. I like watching fun videos, but there's a side of it that is very nasty. And because of the nature of my business, I get a lot of recommendations on my feed, as most people do. And if you're on the secondhand clothing side of TikTok, then you may have heard of some drama and backlash facing a Depop seller who sells secondhand pre-loved clothing. And it was an interesting article. I read an article about it too. All these things were popping up. And it brought up some really interesting points that I think are extremely important to talk about. And being that this podcast is about conversations and questions and things I talk about in the shop, these are things that I talk about with my customers and my friends who come in. And I'd like to give my opinion on it in the way I see it. But there was another article that, I don't know if it was an article. It might have been on Twitter. A woman that I follow who used to go by the Lingerie Addict, fabulous woman. I have one of her books in my shop, named Cora Harrington, retweeted a post about a woman who rehabbed a vintage dress and all of the backlash this individual faced for altering a vintage garment. And there's so much more context to it, but both of these kind of tie in together, and I thought it would be a really great conversation to have. So if that's something you're interested in, keep listening. So I quickly checked back, and this is episode 7. I had to get it correct. It's episode 7. Jeez. Sometimes I amaze myself at how long I can talk. So I'm going to jump in to that BuzzFeed article that I was talking about. And it was interesting how I found it, because as I was talking about, I came across all of this drama on TikTok, which, who else gets exhausted by that? When you just want to go on and watch videos of chubby cats and cute dogs, and you get a bunch of random drama that just isn't necessary. But I had downloaded this app, and I talked about it a little bit on last week's episode. And this app is called Artifact, and it came out and was created by the guys that created Instagram. And after they sold Instagram to Facebook and Meta, they created this news app that was very much like Instagram, in the sense that it curated your feed based on what you like, what you interact with. So with this app, every time I click on an article that interests me, it automatically remembers that and starts spitting forward more articles similar to that. So it wasn't completely random that this article came up, since I read a lot of fashion-related or vintage-related articles. This was in BuzzFeed News, and it came out February 22nd, and it's by Steffi Cow. And it's called, "People Are Calling a Depop Seller, quote, a bad person after she posted a haul of the thrift store finds she planned to sell." The lower headline is searches on TikTok like JB Wells controversy and JB Wells is a bad person have jumped as users debate about the ethics of reselling curated vintage clothing. So that was a really long title. And I first have to point out the glaring cringe that you shouldn't, to have your name attached to something where all people have to do is type in your name and add a bad person at the end of it, and these hateful articles pop up. I mean, just sit on that a moment. That's horrific and sad and not necessary. And it seems like post-pandemic, people have just gotten crueler, especially online. So I just have to preface with the amount of cruelty that I've seen hurled at this young woman is disgusting. And for something that, as I'll get into, I think is ridiculous. So the gist of it is, on TikTok, it's very common for any seller, whether you sell new clothing, jewelry, things that you make, to do hauls of what you bought, what you're selling. I've done vintage hauls before of when I go on buying appointments or I clear out people's estates. I've done hauls of what I've brought. A lot of people do them, and I think they're really fun to watch. And so this Depop seller did a haul video on things that she found at her local thrift store or secondhand shop. And a lot of people, it was very, from what I was looking at in the article, very mixed reaction, but people were either one way or another. So some people have compared her to other resellers, to developers who buy buildings in lower income neighborhoods and push out residents, or giving them mini landlord energy, or bulk buying in low income areas thinking they can turn a profit but ruin the way thrift stores charge for clothing. Now, this has always been an argument, and I heard it growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. This is a narrative that has always existed, but because of online, it's just been thrown into the ether. And so the people who are opposed to what she does say that resellers, vintage and secondhand alike, are unethical for going to thrift stores or secondhand stores, purchasing these clothes, and then reselling them for a markup. And what I think was lost is that there were some comments that said that these resellers will buy like a $2 blouse and sell it for $85, which anybody in the business and even outside of it as a shopper, some people do that. There are vintage sellers that do that. But more often than not, from what I've seen and experienced, the markups usually aren't that severe because then you're not going to make that sale. No one's going to buy an Abercrombie t-shirt that maybe was being sold for $25 for $85. And if you are, that's a whole other conversation. But it was interesting that people brought the low income aspect into it, and that all thrift stores are in low income areas and only low income people shop at thrift stores. And you're taking that away from other people. And to add on to that, we also have to look at the way the thrift and secondhand clothing industry is different than it has been in decades previously. Now, the last time I was in a thrift store, oh my gosh, I think it was a couple of years now. I remember wearing a mask, so I think it was just right after the pandemic and things started opening up. And I was looking around. We had a lot of time to burn when we were bringing my cat to the cities for his chemotherapy. And I wanted to see if I could find a CD player. something really random. Me and my partner were looking through the racks of clothing, and I noticed a ton of overstock clothing from Target. A ton. And this was a big Goodwill. This wasn't just a tiny, little thrift store in a tiny little town. This was a big Goodwill, racks and racks and racks. And the majority of the clothing there were overstock. And it was all from Target. And some of those pieces were priced, I think, a little bit higher than possibly they should have been. But it wasn't just your run-of-the-mill pre-loved clothing. It came from another company. And I don't know the ins and outs of that. But thrift stores today aren't what they were when I was growing up. They're different. And also growing up, I had been on all sides of the financial spectrum. My family was very stable middle class. I had a sister, 2 parents, and due to some health issues in my family and different job things that happen in life, our finances dipped and waved. So you make allowances to save money. And I remember as a kid going to our local Salvation Army, not because it was a necessity, but if we needed new clothes, both me and my sister would go to our local thrift shop, get what we would need, and that was that. We didn't put too much thought into it. But again, with social media, we didn't have people breathing down our necks with the latest trends and that you have to buy this, you have to buy this, you have to buy new, you have to buy what's on trend. And you would see a mix of people. But you can't just look at a person and say they're low income. And I've noticed a lot of people who use that argument. I've asked them, well, when you're in a thrift store and you say it's all low income people trying to find stuff, what makes them low income? Do they have a certain look about them? What is that look? Please enlighten me, because that's an extremely interesting take on looking at someone and determining what you think their financial worth and value is. So there's a lot of nuances and a lot of context that needs to be delved into. But with thrift stores, the point of it is to give people another option. It's always been people who have a lot of clothing that they don't need. You don't want to throw it. So you bring it in and you hope it finds someone who wants, needs, or uses it. And whoever that person is. And if they want to resell it, that's their prerogative. But I know there's a growing group of people that are very off-put, and how they say thrift shops have become it's just another aspect of capitalism. But what I want to put out there, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but in some thrift stores, if they don't have room for these clothes, or if there are clothes that have been sitting a while and they don't need anymore, there are some that throw them and they end up in a landfill. So are you someone who would rather it be in a landfill than go to someone who's actually going to use it? I mean, if said low income people are shopping, are they going to buy enough of that to keep it out of the landfill? Just think about it. And the other side of it are people have said that because of these resellers, that prices at thrift stores are increasing, which that is a valid point. In a lot of thrift stores you go to, you notice that prices are different. They have gotten higher. And there's no one right answer for it. In retail in general, supply chain issues, scarcity, rent hikes, I mean, you name it. That's why prices everywhere go up. But another thing is thrift shops and secondhand, they've gotten very smart because they see that some of the pieces that they get in have value. If my grandmother passed away and my family didn't want any of her stuff and we just chucked it all in a box and gave it to our local thrift store, while they were looking in the box, they found this Miriam Haskell brooch. Did a little Google search, saw that it's actually worth money. Now, logistically, do you think they're going to go, well, we'll just price it at $1 and then it can be someone else's treasure? Do you know a lot of people or businesses that would do that? It's also just common sense. And if there's something really valuable that a thrift store just let pass through and didn't know anything, and if someone were to walk in, if I were to walk in and see it, they don't know what they have, and I buy it, and I go resell it because I know what it's worth. That's the nature of it. That's why a lot of people like thrifting and secondhand shopping, is the thrill of what you can find, regardless of financial and social status. And yes, just like dollar stores, there aren't a lot of actual dollar stores anymore. I mean, everywhere prices are increasing. And I get it. It sucks. But to load all of that on one individual who, in the article, it stated that she started this during the pandemic to get side cash when she couldn't work, and she was a student at the time. I mean, we all do what we have to do to survive. And I get it. If there are sellers, and I just had this conversation with someone the other day. Someone came into my shop and they were from the West Coast. They looked at a certain dress I had and said, gosh, if I would have gotten this in California, this $24 dress would have been like $58, $60, $70, $80. And it's not because those shops are trying to screw you over. It can be their cost of living is higher. Their acquisition fees are higher. Their rent is higher. There's so many different factors that go into it. So I'm looking through this article again, and there's a lot of things that are comments from Twitter. And someone had commented that resale culture is the biggest enemy of our generation. Now, what people, I feel like, in this article didn't understand is that everything's a resale culture. Your local clothing boutique is a resale boutique. They're buying a product from a vendor, and they're technically reselling it, especially if said vendor has their own means to sell it and they're not just a wholesaler. We buy things and we resell them. You go into a thrift store, you buy stuff. If you know you can make a couple extra bucks on it, you resell it. And I'm not the moral authority on what's right or what's wrong. I'm a firm believer in don't be greedy. Price things what they're worth, not what you want them to be or not what you want from them. And people can make their own decisions. What is this worth to you? If this resale Victoria's Secret bra that was worn 4 times is not worth $15 to you, then I guarantee you can probably go somewhere else and find it for cheaper on Depop or eBay or whatever. That's the freedom of it. But if someone wanted to pay $15 for that bra, that's their prerogative. But it really is a shame to load all of our society's anger on a small segment of people who are just trying to make a living and get by. And the interesting thing is, and it's something that just popped into my head, to put it into context, I know this happens a lot in my shop when I have people coming in selling me pieces. And they may have gone to my shop, other shops trying to sell things. And when they get to my store, they often say, well, whatever you don't buy, I'm just taking it to Goodwill and donating it. So everybody can make that decision for themselves. But I want to find some of the tweets that were in support of this young woman. So there's one tweet from someone named Ashley Reese. I keep seeing people saying thrift stores are for people who cannot afford to buy new. But as far as I know, that hasn't exclusively been the case for generations now, especially secondhand shops that are pretty curated. Buying secondhand was trendy way back in the 60s. And that's the thing. And if you think about it, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, earlier, a lot more people knew how to sew, and it was much more common for people to make their own clothes, which is a skill that is kind of a dying art. So we see all of these clothes just packing thrift stores, packing landfills. So what would people rather happen? I mean, just think about it. What would be the alternative? Now, down more in this article, there are two really interesting perspectives on it. And the woman who this article is about, the Depop seller, said, and let me just scroll down to find it. She says, while the demand resellers have for thrifted items is high right now, it's still not higher than the supply of thrifted clothing. Where I live, there are 20 Goodwills, all overflowing, all restocking hourly, and all sending truckloads of excess clothing to the bins. It's terrifying to see the amount of clothing going to waste, while fast fashion continues to pollute and abuse their workers. Reselling pushes circular fashion, sustainable consumption, and helps low-income individuals earn a living wage off of endless clothing. And that's such a great point. Because when you lump all resellers together, you're completely ignoring who they are and where they came from and why they're reselling. A lot of sellers I've met don't just do this for the fun of it. It's how they make their living. And if it's something that they enjoy doing, that's an extra bonus. Now, another person had said that fast fashion's price point is not reflective of the true cost of our clothes, and that needs to change. So when you have online retailers like Shein who pump out new clothing every day, a lot of it ripped off from smaller independent designers, and they sell a dress for $12. That's not what that dress is really worth. Think about the people and the labor that went behind that, and that they're seeing fractions of change when they make that garment. Now, actual clothing, you put the worth in the labor, how long it takes the person to make it, the fabric, the design. Do you really think that's worth $12? I mean, there's so many things that go into it. It's not cut and dry. And I really encourage, if you're someone who really doesn't like reselling and thrifting, and you don't think it's right, really read some of these opinions to give you different perspectives, because I get it. There are people that will just never agree with this and never think it's a good idea, and that's completely your opinion. But just providing a little bit more context on why reselling exists, I think is really important. I think the really amazing thing to come out of it is that it gives an opportunity to earn a living doing something on your own terms and not working for a company or a corporate entity that pays you an unlivable wage to do tons of work to make their bottom line and to make them money. I mean, isn't that what everybody deserves? A life where they can do a job and work a job where they can set their own terms, make money, and not constantly get abused by the workplace system that our country has put in place, taking advantage of workers and employees. I mean, we should be celebrating people who can do this. Because all you need is stuff to sell and a way to mail it. Some social media, a couple pictures, and you're set. So I think it should just be celebrated that people are making money, making a living on their terms. And I think we should be encouraging more people to do that. Now, this next segue is into some things that I was seeing on the Twitter feed of a woman that I followed for years, and her name's Cora Harrington. She's known as the Lingerie Addict. She made her career on giving such amazing insight and advice on lingerie, fit, how clothes are made, the importance of supporting the people who make them. I mean, she's just got such an amazing insight on a lot of things. But before I get into what I was originally going to talk about that I saw on her feed, she got into the discussion on thrifting and secondhand, and she shared her perspective on it, which kind of alludes back to what we just talked about. And she had tweeted, and you can find her also at lingerie_addict if you want to look up on these. But she said, one thing that's interesting to me is how when we're talking about fast fashion, people love to say, but you can't hold individuals responsible. You should blame corporations. Yet in thrifting, people are very quick to blame individuals for rising prices and not the shops. These places are receiving clothes for free, and they can choose how much or how little to mark them up. Why isn't some of that anger reserved for the shops rather than the entirety of the blame, if you believe this is an issue, placed on shoppers? So it's another interesting perspective to let simmer. And her feed is full of just so many amazing perspectives. I could do a whole episode just dedicated to reading and discussing her tweets. And I'm not a huge follower of Twitter. I have an account only to read stuff like this. And before we jump into it, I have to read another tweet that I reposted yesterday. And it ties into this, but it's a standalone tweet that I just thought was genius. And kind of what we were talking about last week on the topic of being trendy. So she had tweeted, "It's okay to not be fashionable. Access to well-made clothing is not the same as access to fashion or trends. We all need clothes, but we don't all need the most cutting-edge looks. I think a lot of people conflate these things. It's fine to not be trendy, actually." And I thought that was just perfect. So, scrolling down a bit, what caught my eye was she had shared a tweet of another person who was talking about seeing this video on, I don't know if it was on Twitter. It must have been on Twitter. And it was a girl who made a video where she got a dress from the 1970s and they called it, retooled it to be modern while still keeping that vintage feel. And I guess that caused a lot of backlash on TikTok because people didn't understand why she had the audacity to cut up a dress and how it's just blasphemy. And this is something that I talk about very openly in the shop and how I feel about the issue of people purchasing vintage clothing and doing, like altering them or doing something different with them. So Cora, when she retweeted this, added on that she thinks that the thrifting discourse has gotten really weird, and that she once wore a shattered silk party dress from the 1920s to an apocalypse party, which sounds pretty fun. She says the dress had no historical value. It was irreparably damaged, and since clothes should be worn, she wanted to give it one last 1920s style party hurrah. Now, for anybody who is familiar with fabrics and what happens as fabrics age and degrade, silk is one of those fabrics that's beautiful and as stunning as it is, especially earlier silks. They, even if cared for properly, are very, very, very hard to maintain. And when you see silk shatter, there is no way to fix it. No way whatsoever. I have a bodice from the turn of the century, beautiful silk brocade with metallic embroidery and lace, flower cutout. I mean, it's beautiful. One day I'm going to properly take a photo of it. And I bought this. Oh my gosh. I actually think I was in high school when I bought it, because I remember being, where was I? I have no idea. I've had it for a very long time. And the woman selling it had gotten a bunch of pieces from a museum textile and preservation collection, and they were selling pieces that were just really destroyed, and they needed to clear out some room, as a lot of museums tend to do. And when I bought it, I think I bought it for like $40. And while you could still see how amazing it was and what it was when it was created, the silk was just falling to pieces. You can't put it on a mannequin. You can't leave it laid out. You can't do really much of anything with it unless you're willing to pick up pieces of it afterwards. So since I purchased it all these years ago, it's been in a sealed museum quality tissue paper packed container. And the last time I brought it out was to show a friend of mine. She was really, I had gotten earlier pieces in from another buying appointment that she came in to see, and I wanted to show her this piece. And just the 5 minutes I had it out, pieces and chunks of the silk were just breaking off. And there's nothing to be done about it. But I would rather show it to someone and let them look at it and touch it and analyze it, instead of just letting it disintegrate into oblivion and no one ever got the chance to experience it. So I understand where she's coming from with this. Clothing is meant to be worn. And especially if it's something that is irreparably damaged, wouldn't you rather just give it that last hurrah than give up on it, throw it away? But going back to this TikToker, I'm going to click on the original thread. My internet is so slow. So this 70s dress, I don't have a picture of it listed or anything, but it's a very quintessential 1970s big poofy maxi dress, very, very indicative of that era, very dated. There is no way anybody would see this walking down the street and ever think that it was a modern dress. It actually almost looks like, when I'm looking at the picture of it, like the before picture, it almost looks like something you wear to a Renaissance festival. It would be perfect for that. And it's a dress that, sure, some people might have seen and thought, nope, this is it. I don't need to do anything to it. It's perfect. And they very much want that look. But as sad as it is, and I've had this many times where I've had dresses come in like this, there aren't a lot of people, unless you're shopping for a costume party, who are going to wear some of these pieces as is. And I've always been a proponent of, I don't believe vintage is costume. I know people who buy it to use as a costume and then end up wearing it as their regular clothes. And I love that. I love it. So it's not uncommon for people who know how to sew and alter clothing to make certain adjustments to it. I've had many people buy mainly, and really it's mainly things from the 70s that were typically very long, buy them and shorten them so they weren't dragging and they'd get more wear out of it and more use out of it. So the gal that did this, she almost made it, if you know of the brand Selkie, they have very poofy cloud-like ruffled dresses. Very expensive. Very expensive. And she turned the dress into something that looked very similar to that. It was shorter, almost, I think it has almost the skirt has a look of like a square dancing dress. And I say that with a lot of respect because I own several vintage square dancing dresses that I absolutely love because you can spin and dance and they have amazing movement. You might hear my music in the background. I just turned it on. So please do not get distracted by that. But a lot of people were really, really upset in the comments. And from what I can see from this post, a lot of people thought it was sacrilegious to be doing that to a vintage garment that, from what I know and from what I've read, there was nothing inherently wrong with it. I can't verify that. It was just very 70s. It almost looks like a 70s bridesmaid's dress. Very, very costumey, if there ever was a costume. And the user who shared this, that the internet has this obsession with preserving unused items and how it's become unhealthy. And I'm just scrolling down just to see some of the comments. And it's interesting because on Twitter, there are a lot of people who say that the dress looks way better. But on TikTok is where a lot of people ended up coming at her. And I get people that come in the shop who openly tell me that they are going to alter the garment somehow. And the only time I ever take issue with it is if it is a garment that has some kind of provenance or history attached to it. I think of it much like at the last year's Met Gala when Kim Kardashian wore Marilyn Monroe's rhinestone happy birthday dress and all of the damage that had come from that and trying to do repairs. I mean, it's just a whole rabbit hole. Now, when you have a garment that has historical significance or some kind of story attached to it, like I said, provenance, that's when it gets a little bit different. I know for me, there are pieces that I sell on the floor that do have very interesting stories attached to them. Now, does that inherently mean that no one can ever mend it or alter it or anything? No. But if it's a garment that it's not damaged, it's in impeccable condition, and it has that provenance, and someone wants to buy it to make it into a purse or a pillowcase, which again I don't know if I've ever had that happen, then that's where I would try to have a conversation about why that may not be the best idea. However, if it's just a garment from the 1970s, like it's a bridesmaid's dress that, is sitting on your rack for a long time because it's a very specific look, and someone knows a way to make it better and make it something that can be worn and doesn't just sit on a rack or end up in a dumpster, then why not? When I started doing auctions, there were a lot of pieces that I had in my back room that were not as I saw fit to put on the floor because they had rips, they were missing things, they had stains, they had a lot of issues with them that you can't ask full price or anything like that. So what I did is I bundled up a bunch of these items in a bulk. And for anybody who wanted to buy them, let's say I had 15 items, like $10. And people take them and rework them. There's a designer in New York that takes vintage wedding dresses in any condition. And anybody who has been around vintage wedding gowns knows that because they're white, they show a lot of age and wear. The trains are usually stained. If they have metallic embroidery or embellishments, you get a lot of tarnish and rust on the dress. A lot of are ripped. I mean, so many issues. And she takes them and she makes them into new wedding dresses. And I think that's amazing. And you breathe new life into these pieces. And it's very different when you have a piece that has a historical significance because of where that garment had been, who was wearing it. And then just a piece of clothing from the 70s that sits lonely on a rack with no one wanting to take a chance on it. I kind of think of it as when I was younger and I played with Barbies. I always wanted the Barbies that were destroyed and missing hair because I felt bad for them and I wanted to give them a makeover and get them to be used. And that's kind of how I see it with vintage clothing. And again, I haven't, at least in my recent memory, had someone come in and take a really beautiful vintage piece and go, I just want to completely dismantle this and turn it into something completely different. Normally it's people wanting to shorten it or tailor it to fit them, or if they don't like the shoulder pads, or if the sleeves are too small, they'll extend the sleeves or add a couple inches in the back. I mean, things like that, which tailoring is what made these clothes. All pieces would be tailored in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even 70s. But to see people get ripped apart for it, and it almost is like that, it's very gatekeepy. And I'm looking up comments again, and people are saying, why wouldn't you just make a new dress? If you're doing this much to a beautiful piece and clearly have the skill, why don't you just make something new? And it goes back to, she's taking a piece that no one wanted and making it into something that can be worn and admired. And people saying it was perfect in its original state. And I'm going to try to describe this dress to you as best I can. And it's not an ugly dress. It takes a lot for me to consider a garment ugly. But it is a floor-length powder blue chiffon maxi dress. It has a little ruffle at the bottom, that high empire waist, and it looks like a little bit of floral brocade going around the bust. And the sleeves are gathered at the mid-arm, the elbow, and the wrist to where it's just more of like a bubble of fabric. Again, it was a pretty dress before, but even I, as many different styles and customers and people I've had come through the store, have never seen someone wear this 70s of a dress out and about. Because again, with this material, it's polyester and chiffon and all these synthetic materials, it's very warm. It has no stretch. And you can't really do much in these dresses, which is why no one wanted them or wore them in the first place. So she took it and shortened it and made it something that she could wear and give new life and honor. It looks like used the same embellishments. She kept the sleeves. She just took the gatherings off of the sleeves that made it tight and almost immovable. She lowered the neckline a bit so it didn't feel as restrictive, because a lot of these 70s maxi dresses, they go all the way up to your neck and they're tight and they're not comfortable, and they weren't meant to be comfortable. So again, I'm looking at the after dress and I think it's just the prettiest. And you still see that original dress in it. It's just way more wearable. But just scrolling through a lot of this, I mean, the hate that this woman got for taking this item and making it her own for no other reason than, well, it's vintage. You shouldn't do anything to it because it's vintage. And while I'm not an advocate for taking everything vintage and dismantling it and making it a whole new project, there are pieces that really do benefit from it. And this, I definitely feel like, was one of them. And if it's damaged, why the heck not? I mean, the original poster, Cora, talking about when she wore a shredded 1920s dress, a lot of people said you shouldn't do that. It's disrespectful. But what's more disrespectful is letting these garments sit and rot, and they don't get a chance to see any kind of glory again. And I love textile preservation, but there are some pieces that cannot be restored and cannot be saved. I did a little TikTok video over the summer after I had done a big estate buying trip, and I had like 20 some boxes of vintage clothing from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And there was an entire box that one of the dresses that was made of synthetic fibers had degraded and created what I call devil dust. It has different names, but it's basically this gritty dust that comes from disintegrating fabrics, and it can be very toxic. You breathe it in. I had a cough for months after that, and I was wearing a mask. Very nasty stuff. And once it starts degrading, that garment cannot be saved. And if that gets on other garments that have similar fabrics, it can potentially ruin those too. And if there was someone that had this genius idea of how they can save a garment like that in any capacity, I would be all for it. Because there's nothing more devastating than seeing these garments get thrown and go to waste. So why not? I get both sides of it. It can be very jarring. We, as vintage lovers, hold vintage to a very high esteem. And if you're a history buff, you almost compare it to history being erased. But history, especially with fashion, is constantly building on something, building on a concept. This 1950s dress has a bunch of moth holes in it that can't be repaired. Instead of throwing it, I'm going to get some beautiful beaded embellishments and sprinkle them across. When I was in college, I bought a 1950s wool dress that had beautiful prong set rhinestones all over it, but the whole neckline was covered in moth holes. Not tiny, tiny little nibbles, but significant moth holes to where repairing it would have been very difficult. And it would have taken away from the look of the dress because you would have seen patches and stuff that I felt would have detracted. But it couldn't have been thrown. It shouldn't have been thrown. So I bought prong set rhinestones that matched the best I could get them. And I fortified all of the holes, whether it be with patching or some really good thread. And I covered those moth holes with more prong set rhinestones. And there's some people that wouldn't agree with that because I'm technically altering the look and the construction of the dress. But I want these pieces to go on and have a life for decades to come. And if that means altering it somehow to get it through the next 60 years, then you bet I'm gonna do it. And I'm not gonna be sorry about it. I'd love to know what you all think about this. This is one of my favorite conversations to have in the store because there's really no right or wrong answer. And ultimately, I think whether it be in thrifting or in people buying vintage pieces to redo, what happens to pieces once they leave a business, we don't know. But it is interesting just how heated people get about it, even to go as far as to threaten the lives of people who are just doing things that inspire them or make them happy. It's interesting. Imagine that. I know this was something a little different, but sometimes it's just nice to talk about articles and things that I've been reading that have a relevance to my shop and just talk about it, pick it apart, see different perspectives and what other people are saying. And I might do episodes sprinkled out here and there if I see an article that I think is interesting and want to talk about it. But I hope you liked today's episode. I think for next week's episode, I have an idea. I love doing history and talking about the history of the building that my shop is located in and buildings associated with it. And I've been getting, again, really into a building that used to be near where my shop was called the Waldorf Hotel. It's changed to the Earl Hotel and had many different names and incarnations in its time. And just some of the historical background on that hotel and how it pertains to my shop. And maybe I'll sprinkle in how it pertains to some of the ghost stories and paranormal happenings that have happened in the building. Now, if you want a little bit more background on this, head over back to season 1, where I talk about ghost stories in my shop and in the building that my shop is in. If you want a little bit of background on it, I will talk and rehash some of it, but this is going into more of the history behind the building and some of the cool things and history makers that were involved in it. Hopefully that will be next week's episode. It's my plan. So we'll see. Thank you so much for joining me again this week. And check back next week on another whole new episode. Bye.